Jennifer, you're muted.
You'd think I'd remember that by now. So I just said thank you, Jonas, and many thanks to Arturo and Alicia for all you've done to organize this wonderful panel. So I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the fourth event in the Toward Transformative Justice Community Roundtable series on race, racism, and policing, which is hosted by the Northwestern Prison Education Program. As Jonas said, I'm the director of NPEP, and we provide a degree-granting comprehensive liberal arts education to people who are incarcerated in Illinois. As our nation reckons with the systemic racism of America's criminal justice system and its pernicious investment in policing, criminalization, and incarceration, this roundtable series aims to open up space for conversation on these urgent topics and to bridge research, legal work, policy, and community activism in addressing them. Roundtable discussions will be held twice per month throughout the summer, and we have 2 more scheduled for the last month. So I hope you'll be able to join us at some of those future events. So welcome again, and now I will turn things back over to Jonas.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will, in a minute, introduce our first panelist. I do want to say 2 things really briefly before we get started. And the first one is that the title of this panel is Policing and the University. But of course, this is also about policing in our university, because I'm sure a lot of you know that at Northwestern, there are police divestment efforts too. And the organization team for today's panel had been in contact with some of the students who've been working on the petition that circulated a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, due to logistical issues, they couldn't join us today, but we hope that the panel today can provide a different aspect to this conversation that's happening on campus. And the second thing is that as a prison education program, we are hosting this series in part because our own incarcerated students are those who are most vulnerable to policing and racism in the US. So it's really important for us to have these conversations in relationship to our incarcerated students. Unfortunately, they cannot join us today at an event like this one, but we continue to work towards a world where all of our students would be able to be present at an event like today's. With that being said, I will introduce the first panelist, Professor Davarian Baldwin, who is the Paul Raether Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. His academic and political commitments have focused on global cities, and particularly the diverse and marginalized communities that struggle to maintain sustainable lives in urban locales. Baldwin is the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life, among many other publications. And he is currently at work, amongst other projects, on a project titled Universities, How Higher Education is Transforming Urban America. He is also a coordinating member of Scholars for Social Justice, where he works on the question of reparations in higher education and other questions. Davarian, we know how busy you must be, especially this summer, so thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Oh, thank you so much, Jonas. And I just want to thank you, Alicia and Arturo and Jennifer, for inviting me to be here this afternoon to speak about this convergence between campuses or universities and policing. This is a topic that I've been working on for the last 15 years as an academic and an activist, but had no idea that it would have such a drastic impact on our current kind of political climate and the atmosphere. That it would be so front and center to conversations that are brewing and bubbling in the current moment. And like I do with all these conversations, I just want us to have a moment of reflection on a few names that are prescient and relevant for this conversation. Tyrone West at Morgan State University, LeVar Douglas at Coppin State, Baltimore, Stephanie Washington at Yale, New Haven, Charles Sonji Thomas at UChicago, and Kelly Brinson, Lorenzo Collins, Everett Howard, and Samuel DuBose at the University of Cincinnati. These are just a few of the names of people of color who have either been shot and most of these people killed at the hands of campus police. And all of the university police forces involved in these killings or shootings have jurisdiction beyond their immediate campuses, some with jurisdiction over the entire city. All were armed private police forces with public authority, and no public oversight whatsoever. Let me repeat that. They have no public oversight whatsoever, yet they're private security forces with jurisdiction over their cities. And they're not only surveilling our communities, but sometimes killing us. So with this in mind, we are posed with the question, what does this all mean? Well, for me, this is an issue that has been quite relevant, and we've heard this phrase probably a lot in the last 4 or 5 weeks. This is an issue of racial capitalism. This idea about the way in which racial division, racial inequities, racial diversity, racial disparity shapes the production, distribution, and dissemination of capital within our current economic system. And so talking about the convergence between universities and policing is not separate, is not different, is not disentangled from this conversation about racial capitalism that's brewing all over the country and all over the world today. Why? Well, for decades, city schools used federal urban renewal dollars to build institutional walls and bulldoze blocks to fortify the divide between ivory towers and the largely brown working class communities that surrounded urban campuses. However, by the 1990s, things began to change. After fortifying themselves off from urban environs, these Black and brown urban environs, campuses and colleges began to say, oh, wait a minute, there's an interest in the city, that the urban is back in vogue. After decades of white flight, there became this new white interest in cities, in these areas that primarily surrounded campuses. But after years, after decades of turning their backs on cities, campuses had to engage the city with a new orientation. So now, by the time we get to the 1990s, schools begin to stretch their legs, attempting to assert their authority in cities largely driven by what we call the knowledge economy, where academic research is being used to create profitable commercial goods in a range of fields, from pharmaceutical industries and software products to military defense weaponry. Key to recruiting the best students, faculty, and their families to do this work is creating an urbane cluster of housing, retail, and nightlife right in the middle of existing communities of color. Why? Because these areas are relatively cheap, considering the wealth of universities and their investors, and the people in these communities hold little political authority to push back against university efforts to seize control of these neighborhoods. So therefore, it's not an accident that in almost all cases, the jurisdiction of university police extends to the areas targeted for campus expansion in this new knowledge economy. In these campus zones, we find an intense surveillance of Black and brown behavior to prepare the space for creating university citadels, or what we call gentrification, or probably more accurately, displacement. So in today's moment, in this current moment, we can see how schools have become what some scholars have called a parastate. P-A-R-A state, a parastate. They govern parts of our cities by deploying the brute strength of campus police alongside the soft power of campus building to enact a violent confiscation and control of local communities, and the results have been Black dehumanization and sometimes death. So quickly, how did we even get here, looking back historically? Well, campus forces, police forces, have existed in our cities and as in general for over a century, with the first campus cop at Yale University in 1894. These campus police first held what we call a custodial function of taking care of students, of keeping them out of trouble. But with the student protests and social unrest in the 60s and 70s, many campus police started to look like their city counterparts. Also, majority white schools in chocolate cities had to signal safety to potential white families. But things drastically changed in the new millennium. Stats show that now 92% of public schools and 38% of private schools have police officers. Nearly all carry guns, and about 9 in 10 have arrest and patrol jurisdiction off campus. More than 100 colleges also got armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons from the notorious Department of Defense 1033 program that was made visible after the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri. And while these private police forces move further off their campuses, most states protect them from the Freedom of Information Act. Therefore, we can't know exactly what they're doing because they are private entities. So in the name of campus safety, our urban communities of color around campuses have become especially dangerous pressure points around the broader politics of police violence that we're seeing becoming so clear today after the incidents involved with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and the list goes on and on and on. Many schools look to the University of Chicago, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, as the perfect model. But 5 years ago, the campaign, as the perfect model for policing, as how to do policing. But 5 years ago, the Campaign for Equitable Policing at UChicago identified a draconian pattern of racial profiling and a two-tier policing system. So here we have a student and a community member being accused of the same infraction, for example, where the student meets the dean, the resident is shuttled through the criminal justice system. Now, the new iteration of the Campaign for Equitable Policing, which is now defunct, is Care Not Cops, which we'll hear about from Michelle in a minute. But this preceding organization made it clear that this two-tier policing system was setting up a standard of practice that we are starting to see duplicated in urban campus communities all across the country. Just last year, Johns Hopkins pushed for their own private police force, and they too looked to UChicago as the model. But Baltimore residents and students did not see a model of possibility. They saw a model of terror. State Senator Mary Washington called a private security force with no oversight, quote, a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore. Students and residents staged a month-long sit-in where they directly identified such campus policing tactics as the first stage of gentrification. So universities have signaled a major shift, no longer bunkering down behind ivory towers. They have embraced a velvet hammer approach to expansion. Upscale housing and retail follow behind a militarized version of the campus police who privatize our communities for university interests. Now, currently within today's divest, invest police activism on campuses across the country, we see broad calls for implicit bias training, tuition reduction, additional faculty lines and resources for Black studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, all great and necessary demands. However, in order to build the future that we want to see, we must be profoundly sober about the reality that we face. We need to have a complete reckoning with the full reach of the university's power within our broader political economy, in particular in our cities, and the role campus police play within what I call these new universities. Let's be clear. Universities are the largest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and policing agents in major cities all across the country. The pandemic made this reality very clear. When people's lives were shut down and economic deprivation increased, many people who were not students nor faculty, lives were already tied to the political economy of universities as frontline, low-wage workers in cafeterias, as groundskeepers, as low-level medical assistants and staff, and as security agents, as well as residents in university-owned housing. So there are numerous ways in which universities touch so many aspects of our lives that have nothing to do with classrooms or laboratory research. A lot of this is being masked or being made invisible because we aren't doing enough analysis alongside the community organizing and direct action protests. We need to align our vision of the university with the way we daily experience the university in the cities that surround these campuses. So for example, when people talk about austerity or the limits of university budgets, we're probably only talking about maybe half of the political economy of universities. First, claims of austerity are not based on an objective observation of the balance sheet, but a tactical strategy for shuttling resources into one budget line as opposed to others. So when administrators or cities talk to us about budgets and their limited ability to redistribute funds, they don't even mention within universities the real estate department, the development office, the technology transfer department, the data mining contracts they have with cities, the university foundation, or even the police force. There are so many aspects of the university that generate wealth off the backs of students and city residents that go far beyond teaching and tuition, that are not even part of discussion. All universities are tax exempt, and they become tax shelters for high-level financiers and related companies that find ways to do their business within a campus domain. So I say all this to highlight that if we are going to have a real reckoning with the shape and the militarized force of universities, we have to have a macro level analysis and then dive back deeper. For example, at the University of Chicago, when residents and students were fighting for the trauma center, it doesn't become a surprise that the campus police were the front line to protect the interests of the university, to create profitable boutique medical services at the cost of indigent care. It's these kinds of relationships and connections that must be a part of any conversation if we're ever going to tackle the real problems of universities and building political possibilities. In this context, knowledge production means rethinking our relationship to each other within the university, where the city is the campus. And thus the university must become a commons, a community space in which knowledge takes place in relationship to communities and living struggle. Knowledge production is then not simply in the classroom, but is manifest through the struggles for police divestment, investment campaigns, in fighting for a living wage for the ivory tower working class, in demanding university-based affordable housing, in insisting on community benefits agreements tied to campus projects, in expecting university medical centers to provide quality indigent care for the neighborhoods that surround it. And therefore we can look at rising resistance movements at places like Johns Hopkins and UCLA, or UChicago's reparations campaign, where students and residents together hold firm, fighting for a right to remain and build a better human existence. And we must all join this fight, armed with a broader knowledge and awareness of our current conditions, pushing forward to betray the university in the way in which it's currently existing, building a comprehensive abolition project. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Davarian, for those remarks, in particular for really broadening our scope of thinking about these questions. That's really wonderful. Before I introduce our second panelist, I just want to briefly remind you that you can start sending questions for the Q&A to Arturo Chang or Alicia Nunes. Maybe the two of you can just drop your name into the chat so that people know who to write to. But introducing our second panelist, I would like to welcome Michelle Yang, who is a student organizer with the University of Chicago's Group United and has been organizing with UC United's Care Not Cops that Davarian mentioned and cultural centers campaigns for the last 2 to 3 years. Having graduated, they are currently transitioning out of student organizing and are working with the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, who were recently here for the second event of our series. Michelle, we're so happy to have you here, both because student voices are such an important part of this discussion and because it kind of relates back to an earlier event of the series that we've had. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, really excited to be on this panel with Davarian again. So I guess I can just start by giving like an introduction on Care Not Cops and UChicago United. So Care Not Cops is a joint campaign of students working against prisons and UChicago United. Care Not Cops was formed out of the shooting of Charles Thomas, who Davarian was talking about. He was a Black student undergoing a mental health crisis, and he was like shot by the UCPD. He was brought to the hospital in handcuffs, and then he was put on electronic monitoring. The case was like pending for a longest time, like just for I think like a year or 2 years. They just kept pushing back the trial date. And then this past October, Charles had another mental health crisis where, due to a technical violation, he broke house arrest, and then he was put in Cook County Jail. Since just like in this year, a lot of the Karen Cops' work has been focused on getting the charges that were pressed against Charles, which is I think like 8 charges, dropped. And so these charges, and one of these charges includes assault of an officer. So clearly, right, like the contradictions there, like a student undergoing a mental health crisis being prosecuted for this. And so, but with around COVID, when COVID was really coming up, for Karen Cops, we kind of shifted to trying to get Charles out, and we were working with his family and one of his close friends on doing that. And then we were successful in that at the end of April, I believe. And then also in May, with kind of like uprisings happening all around the country, we kind of re-released a set of specific demands to defund, disarm, and disband UCPD, with our specific demands being like UChicago administrators cut the UCPD budget by 50% in the upcoming fiscal year, and reinvest those resources into community-driven kind of life-affirming projects, to disarm UCPD of all weapons, including tasers, and to release a plan by October of how they will disband by 2022. So I think something that I want to kind of emphasize is that like abolition has been part of Karen Cops since the beginning, when we first formed 2 years ago, and also that like Karen Cops is like within this longer legacy of student organizing at UChicago. So like I think what Davarian was mentioning, there was a Coalition for Equitable Policing before us, and then before that, that was the Trauma Center campaign, right? So there has always been this student organizing effort, kind of targeting the parasitic relationship of the university on the surrounding communities and trying to dismantle that. So I want to talk a little bit about UC United. So Karen Cops is a campaign of UChicago United, which is a coalition of students of color working to build student of color power and like ultimately transform the university. And so what we really do is organize. And I feel like we have a very specific way of thinking about organizing, which is like we are trying to build relationships and build power so we can like we can have this people power to like get what we want and like get our needs met. And so I think it's really important to think about Karen Cops alongside the other 2 UC United campaigns, which is the campaign for Ethnic Studies Department and Cultural Centers. So these 3 campaigns like really complement each other, and we kind of came to this analysis looking back at the Third World Liberation Front and the Lumumba Zapata Coalition in the 60s and 70s in California, and like their drive to kind of like transform the university from one that's like run by administrators, largely serves white and wealthy interests, and reproduces the status quo. And we want to be transforming that into a university that is run by all people and serves all people within the larger university system, right? Because we know that the university isn't just faculty and students, it's also staff, it's grad labor, it's all these workers, like all these people are also part and integral to like making the university run. Part of Karen Cops' analysis around UCPD is that like the goal isn't to just get rid of like this private police force. Part of abolition, right, is I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore says this a lot, but like abolition is about presence and not just absence. And so we also want to be doing work to kind of like abolish the cops in our heads and undoing like the oppression that we've kind of like internalized, and that we like put out into our interpersonal relationships, you know, just by being socialized in this world, right? Like we end up taking on a lot of like unhealthy and kind of like toxic habits. And so UChicago has its own, you know, like culture of like a toxic culture of stress and isolation. And I think this isn't, you know, unique to UChicago, but kind of like very specific things that I can name around this. It's just like the sense that you need to be sacrificing your well-being, and like sacrifices like this sacrifice of like physical and mental health is like connected to your intellectual rigor, or also kind of like policy wise, like I think it was a year after Charles was shot, UChicago created this new, they basically increased the class load you could take. So before it was 3 to 4 classes, and now you can take 5 with like no additional financial kind of like with no extra payment. And this kind of like changed what was kind of like, you know, considered normal, like a normal class load to take. And, you know, the more classes you take, the more you're kind of like stuck in doing work, the more you are, you know, being at libraries, the less you're hanging out with your friends, the less that you have time to just like have time to yourself and reflect and like think about your, you know, like your place in the world, and also like time to do organizing and that kind of stuff, right? So like it's like all kind of tied together. And so this culture, right, like I think it really promotes tendencies to like police ourselves and each other to conform to these ridiculous standards and like buy into the dominant narratives at UChicago of like what life for a UChicago student should be like, and like what kind of, you know, what kind of futures, you know, are kind of like, you know, meant for us. And so I think this really drives up like shame around, you know, taking like a lot of self-shame around like trying to, you know, meet your needs and get rest, and like take time off. I think it also promotes like self-isolation or like conflict avoidance, or we like, you know, seek conflict out of ego. And so part of Care Not Cops' work is like, we also really want to be building like healthier community cultures, where we kind of like center our abilities to change and transform. And so this is like, I think a lot about like Grace Lee Boggs, and her words that like, to transform the world, you also have to transform yourself. And how we build these community cultures, right, isn't, part of it is like setting intentions, right? And like, you know, we have all these like practices that we've learned from, you know, other movement work, like, you know, ground rules and like how to mediate conflict and stuff like that. But I think part of like building these healthier community cultures is just to like be in practice and be in struggle together. So the work that we do while we're organizing, right, like we're learning how to be in collective together, like collective in the sense of not just like we're individuals working on this project and we all have like our, you know, our separate areas, and, you know, we come and meet and it's like super professional about, like that's not what being in collective means, right? Like being in collective, I really feel is about like learning how to like address conflict. It's like learning how to being in alignment and to like just like work together. And I feel like these kinds of things it's hard to articulate, but when you're doing the work and when you're feeling it, right, like something that we've talked about for like our own kind of like mental health or like wellness check within student organizing is like when the work feels best, like how does it make you feel? And when it's not that great, like how does it make you feel, to kind of like get a sense of like, you know, like organizing work, liberatory work, like this is important work, this is like self-transformation work, this is collective work, and that's right, like that's also part of the kind of like abolition framework we have. And so how this connects with like ethnic studies and cultural centers is like ethnic studies kind of like, and this is kind of touching on what Davarian was talking about with like knowledge production and the knowledge economy, which is a new term for me, and I really like that term. Yeah, it's about like changing, you know, the relationship that we have to, or at least the way that we see it, right? It's like transforming the relationship you have to like knowledge and like what knowledge is valuable, how we learn knowledge, because like a lot of things, like I feel like a really important part of organizing for a lot of me and my peers is that like it's given us analysis, it's given us this like deep like sense of embodiment with like the theory that we will learn in class. Like we really like we're learning it in new ways, we're learning it in like new angles or new perspectives almost, and we have like a different like connection with it because we're trying to like put it into practice and figure out how to like, you know, actually not just like talk the talk, but like, you know, like practice and like walk the walk, I guess. And then for cultural centers, I think like what's really like cultural centers isn't just in like a kind of diversity and inclusion framework where, you know, it's about like building bridges or like having conversations or like, you know, sensitivity trainings. Like the point of cultural centers, the way that we see it is that this is a space for students to kind of like practice, right? Practice addressing conflict, practice, you know, building a sense of awareness, practice like having a better relationship with the self and the ego. And so, yeah, like that's really like what cultural centers is trying to do, is like trying to take the kind of like transformation work that we're feeling within our organizing spaces and bring that on like a broader structural level. Yeah, and I think the last thing that I want to talk about is just the Care Not Cops occupation that happened just this past June. So a brief context about Care Not Cops occupations, because this is actually the third occupation that we did this year. And the first occupation was the one 2 years ago, the same year that Charles was shot. And we were really looking towards Let Us Breathe's action at Homan Square called Freedom Square, where they occupied the square, I think, for like 41 days. And like, it was really to like practice what like an abolitionist world would like look like and feel like. And actually, I think it was the 4-year anniversary very recently, and there was like a protest around that, or like a rally. So yeah, so the first Care Not Cops occupation, like we were really looking towards like Let Us Breathe and like Freedom Square and like trying to replicate that. And then so that was the occupation 2 years ago. And this past year we occupied the Care Not Cops, we occupied UCPD headquarters, and our demand was to meet with our provost Kai Lee and the UCPD chief Kenton Rainey, a meeting in person or kind of like with some kind of like public accountability measure. And this is because 2 years ago, after that first occupation, we did get a meeting with our, the provost then was Daniel Diermeyer and Derek Douglas, who's kind of like the VP of like civic engagement, like that kind of realm. We had a meeting with them and they kind of like shot us down, right? Like they were like, so you want us to just like get rid of all police like tomorrow? Like that's what you want? Like that's so unreasonable. Really like, you know, being incredibly dismissive, incredibly like condescending around like, you know, us also being like young people, right? And a lot of us were like women and non-binary people. So the point of like trying to get them to meet with us meet with us with this like public accountability measure isn't to just like, you know, have the meeting. Cause like we know through our experience and also studying other student movements and talking with other student organizers is that, you know, the campaign isn't won in meetings, it's won in the streets. You win campaigns when you make it, when your actions are so, you know, disruptive and like embarrassing for the university that they have kind of like no choice but to acquiesce to your demands. And so I think that's something, that's also something I've been thinking about lately, just the divest invest strategy, because I feel like we talk about that rhetorically, right? Like we're trying to divest from UCPD and put it into mental health resources, but our actual strategy or the strategy that seems to work at UChicago, if we're looking at the trauma center campaign, if we're looking at like other campaigns that have had some wins, but like not the win that they are like ultimately holding for, is that like the way you win at university, because like there's just no way to negotiate with administrators, you know, like administrators aren't here to negotiate. When they come to the meeting, they're trying to demobilize you. They're trying to make you feel that, you know, you're not legitimate in your stance. You don't have enough knowledge for it. You know, you need to do more policy research, you know, or something to like, before you can meet with them, before, you know, you have the right solution. But we know, right, like communities already have have a lot of mechanisms and practices they've developed, you know, like surviving in the conditions like under white supremacy and capitalism and all of that, right? Like they have those things. It's these systems that make it hard for these wellness practices to flourish and to grow. And so I really feel that the strategy for universities is to just make it, you want to be organizing with you know, different groups of people, with students, with grad students, with faculty, with staff, building these relationships, because that's what the university actually is, right? And so our occupation was like a small stab at that, right? Like it was, we brought all these people together. We were in UCPD headquarters for about like 22 hours. A lot of the people that came, like people didn't know each other, you know, but we were like trapped in this, in the UCPD headquarters, or like trapped in the sense that they wouldn't, if they were like, you can leave at any time, but you can't come back in. And then they denied us bathroom access. They denied us access to food and water as a way to kind of like force us out in a kind of, you know, like softer way. But like in that space, we problem solved how to keep morale up, how to like build relationships with each other, how to communicate with each other while like, you know, like UCPD was like on guard in that space with us the entire time, you know, how to communicate with that without them knowing. We figured out, you know, like a bathroom situation, which was that we coordinated with a few people outside. Someone like pressed the like the candy handicap button to like open the doors, and like someone threw the diapers in. We were there to receive it. We had tents set up, like all of this problem solving stuff. You can't really, like that was a way that we like practice, right? Like building the world we want to see and like having those skills. And then, you know, that was just one occupation. There were some, there, like looking back, right? Like when we were debriefing, we were like, oh, we know what other things we can be doing better next time. What are some, you know, maybe like new organization processes, practices, like how can we better, like, you know, set up phone or kind of like little pods beforehand, stuff like that, right? So like organizing is also about like learning in the process, involving, and like, you know, yeah, I feel like that when I think about student organizing, I feel like there's just so much potential, and there's also just such like a rich tradition of like students and young people just like creating, like budding the futures that they want to see like in these kind of small spaces, and then they like bring it elsewhere, right? Like these connections, like the sense of a movement, like that is like how that I feel like is how the world is gonna, like the world that we want to live is gonna be made, right? Like all these little tiny experiments culminating in like where like through these little experiences we're like learning, right? Like learning from mistakes, like building up new capacities and skills, and like that's how we're gonna, you know, that's the kind of like my theory of change.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That was great, walking us through all the different aspects of the activities at UChicago and beyond. That's really wonderful. So we have a lot of questions already coming in for the Q&A, so continue to send those to Arturo and Alicia. And I think I'll just start with the first one, which is a question for Davarian to bring you back into the discussion. And the question from the audience reads, what differences, if any, are there between public and private universities in terms of the model you described? And then also thinking about whether this phenomenon is specific to the US or whether that can be seen globally. This might be a little beyond your research, but perhaps you can talk to that too.
No, thank you for that question. Okay, I tried to elucidate this, but I probably was going too fast. But there is a difference in terms of private universities are protected with anonymity they're shielded from the Freedom of Information Act because it argues that private entities should not be subject to you know, public scrutiny in the same kind of way. Whereas, say, the police force, just to give an example, the police force at the University of Maryland would be subjected to Freedom of Information Act laws. They also would, because their budget is tied to the state, that can be a lever upon which political actors, through either encouraging good behavior with additional funding or pulling away funding for bad behavior, can have some control or oversight over police forces. With private police forces or private campuses, in most cases, the only authority that a private police force has to listen to is the president and the board of trustees, which makes them extremely dangerous entities when they create their own private police forces. It becomes a little bit murky when you have a private university subcontracting subcontracting city police to work for them. Then it becomes a little bit murky in terms of the jurisdiction, in terms of even if these police officers are off duty, if they're still subjected to the responsibilities that are tied to their primary policing job, which is working for the city. So that's something that has not been tested, and it's going to be tested in activism. It's going to be tested in lawsuits to see whether they are then subjected to their responsibilities as public police officers in their normal job, so to speak. But the main thing is jurisdiction, and the main issue is being shielded from freedom of information. But being able to shield your activities, your stops, your arrest records, your data. Those are the main issues of difference in terms of oversight, in terms of state oversight.
Great. And do you have any thoughts on the global context? Yes.
So particularly with NYU Abu Dhabi, as they've expanded they're franchising NYU like McDonald's. And so the Abu Dhabi, it's not even a campus, the Abu Dhabi branch, if you will, or campus. I'm still looking into this, but I'm finding out slowly that local police have been tasked with special responsibilities for protecting that campus. That gives them an added layer of jurisdictional authority that is not subject to the same responsibilities that would be dictated in any other part of Abu Dhabi. And so, again, I'm not fully vested in that discussion, but it's something that needs to be studied and followed up for. Because there are ways in which these campuses, on one level, people have argued that these campuses in these states that don't necessarily have the same protections for freedom of speech or for gender protections, they become these autonomous zones for freer or American-style amendments and constitutional rights. But there are also ways in which they become zones for the bracketing of labor protections and policing protections in these autonomous zones. So that's something that needs to be engaged more fully on the international scene.
That's great, thank you. The next question I think either or both of you could speak to what extent are efforts to defund policing in public schools, such as CPS, connected with similar campaigns at universities? Are there any overlaps, differences that organizers see, or even from a scholarly perspective that stand out?
Michelle, go ahead, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I can share my 2 cents. I think definitely, I feel like one thought is just like the universities are a cornerstone of a bunch of of these oppressive systems, right? Like not only the kind of like scholarly contributions toward like tech and science and the military, but also like sociological kind of like social science research that goes into like creating certain like I think the Moynihan report is like a really good example, like creating certain like narratives that are used for like policy and yeah, so part of like why I think it's important for students to be organizing in like against their universities is like that is where that's where we have that leverage. Like we're like we're tackling like one part of the prison industrial complex, right? And to like dismantle like the thing about like the complexes, the MIC, PIC, like all those things. It's like there's a bunch of interlocking systems, and so we're trying to tackle one part of it and break like just one aspect of it, knowing that there are other people that we are working in alignment with who are like tackling all the other parts. So I feel like CPS or CPD out of CPS, right, is like tackling the school to prison pipeline from like in K to 12 schools. Like university students are tackling it. Are tackling like the university's connection to the PIC. And it's about like breaking breaking those kind of like connection points, but also like in that work, like creating the kind of like relationships and like seeding those alternatives while we're doing the work.
I'll just add that there are moments of parallel action between, say, public schools and public or private universities in terms of divesting the police, but there are also like solidarity campaigns. So but there also are direct relationships. So there are moments where universities subcontract off-duty police officers from city police to work on campuses. And so you have direct engagement activist practices, like for example, at the University of Minnesota, at the same time that you have activists saying, get out of our public schools, you had activists pushing the University of Minnesota to get subcontracted city police off the campuses. Same thing is happening at UCLA and USC. And there's a precedent for that people don't talk enough about in your city, in Chicago. When the community college became Malcolm X Junior College in 1969, one of the first things that Black students there did was that they recognized that the campus police were off-duty CPD, and they kicked them off the campus and they hired a Black-owned security agency that were unarmed to walk the campus. So that's not as perfect as abolition, but even as early '69, we saw campus activists seeing the impact that city police and policing was having on the livelihood and the way in which they imagined, and Michelle talked about knowledge, the way they imagined community, that they had to get out. And there had to be a realignment of power and community in the new campus zone. And I think that's an important model and precedent that we can build on and expand and push forward.
Great, thank you. I think the next question gets to one of the responses that at least I hear most often when talk about university policing comes up, and that is on-campus shootings. So the question asks, how did the rise in on-campus shootings affect the presence of police forces on university and other school campuses? Were there any changes in the way policing and educational spaces were related? And then maybe you could also talk about how you envision a campus culture that can be prepared for these incidents, or how do we think through campus safety differently than the way we do it today?
I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, and I in no way mean to trivialize campus shootings, but the climate after campus shootings became a cottage industry for the police economy. As soon as it happened, you had a massive influx of calls on campuses across the country for ratcheting up policing and arming police and increasing police forces on campuses as a way to deal with the so-called campus shooting menace. Now, the irony or the reality is that there was no reported uptick or correlation between reducing the shooting and increasing campus police. In fact, later studies have shown that campus policing in its current formation would be utter failure to be able to deal with campus shooting, because there is all this investment in police patrolling and armament that there is no redistribution of funding for its community engagement. There's no investment in mental health and wellness. There's no engagement in terms of sexual violence prevention care. There's no engagement in terms of the confiscation of drugs and alcohol, which is a primarily white campus infraction. That the very structure of campus policing would do nothing to mitigate the conditions that help create what become situations where campus shootings take place, because of the focus on simply the show of force. And so, in my estimation, and what the studies show, is that there would have to be entirely new, the current calls for divest, invest, work in concert with thinking about how to create a better climate where we can see an actual reduction of campus shootings. They were able to come up again. They don't even happen to the same degree, but to even come up again would be based on creating a different campus climate versus showing and the exhibition of force, which had become the immediate response after campus shootings.
Thank you, Davarian. Michelle, do you want to add anything to that, or should we move to the next?
I think I would just echo a lot of what Davarian was saying, like, and would just want to add, like, I think the kind of like biggest I guess like issues on campus, you know, is I feel like one, like sexual assault and like gender-based violence. And you know, we know that like police don't do anything about that. And we know that like going to administrators, like going through Title IX is not always like the best process, and it often like prolongs, you know, like the way like cases are dragged out, like the kind of resolution may not always be the most satisfying, may not always like, you know, may not, and often is not like, you know, in connection to like the healing of the actual survivor, right? Like police cannot help with that. You know, like what we really need is to like invest in like better community practices and like, you know, do that kind of like transformation work to get rid of like to change the conditions that would even allow for like, you know, these like assault and like harassment and gender-based violence to even occur in the first place.
Let me just add one more thing. Thank you for saying that, Michelle. I want to just make sure that you maybe think about something to say, is that we have to be very clear that universities are corporations. They're industries. And so when we look at the function of policing for a corporation, their primary job is brand management. And so when we look at situations where it comes to sexual violence, or it comes to even violence in the surrounding neighborhoods, the desire is to in the neighborhoods is to display a show of force that says this space is safe for your consumption, full paying, tuition bearing students. And when it comes to issues of sexual violence on these campuses, it's to bury those issues in litigation. And to, if there is drug abuse or alcohol overdoses, is to get those students to the hospitals as quickly and quietly as possible to maintain the management of the brand. And that we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, thank you, Davarian. I think that's really helpful to ground us, to ask what are actually the questions that, the problems that are arising on campus, and what would be appropriate responses to that. That's really helpful. The next question comes from a worry that disbanding campus police would end up meaning that the campus is then simply policed by city police forces. So this person is asking whether there is much data available on arrest rates and complaints about misconduct for campus police forces versus city police forces, and what that difference might entail.
Well, I'm sorry to say that there are problems on both sides. The biggest issue is that campus police primarily get their personnel from city police. This was a huge problem in Baltimore after a federal expose on the corruption of the police at the very moment that Johns Hopkins was calling for a private police force that would pull primarily from Baltimore PD. So there hasn't been a lot of comparative, I guess, statistical analysis between the campus versus the city police, but we know that policing needs to be reformed. And in this current groundswell of political activism, campus policing divest investment is part of the broader campaign for divest invest in cities and towns and rural areas writ large. And so the answer is not turning to city police as a solution. The approach is, as Michelle pointed out, creating conditions that no longer need police. And I mean, and we have precedent for this. For example, the great senator from the state of New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she got asked about divest invest, and like, what do you mean we just not have police? What do you mean? And she's made this very clear point. She was like, you know, in your suburbs, when when Johnny or Susie gets caught with drugs or alcohol, what do? You do everything you can. You put them in a drug treatment program. You give them community service. You surround them by their family and the people around them to make a better life, to have support systems. You do everything you can to prevent putting that young person through the criminal justice system. We want the same approach for our kids, right? We know community policing. We know divest works for the communities that don't look like whoever holds the levers of power. We want the same thing in our communities. Simple as that.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like the point of organizing and to building that people power is to prevent, like, you kind of sidestep questions like that, right? Like, the point isn't to have like a better police force, a more professional police force. Like, UCPD is like accredited, has like 2 different accreditations, and like that it's like Kalia and something else, and you know, they're always talking about how like a lot of other campus police forces, like, or city police, don't have that, right? But the point is that like policing doesn't work anytime, you know, like when we're doing when Karen Cops is doing work around UCPD, we know very clearly that like our work will not be done just when UCPD is abolished. Like, you know, the campaign after the campaign, we're probably going to transition, you know, like we're in solidarity. We try to be in community with abolitionist groups in the city working to abolish CPD. I feel like I would just, actually, I lost my thought.
That's all right. I think the next question kind of ties into that, what you were saying, Michelle, and also Davarian, which is that the campus is located in a city. So this next question is asking, what can communities do to participate in these campaigns if they are not members of the university? For example, people who live in Evanston or Hyde Park, but do not have any formal connections to Northwestern or U of C.
Well, let me just say real quickly, and I don't think that citizenship should be predicated on tax paying, but just to be very clear, if you are a citizen of Evanston, you are directly and intimately tied to what happens at Northwestern University. Okay, let's be clear about that first of all, because these universities are tax exempt entities, and from a fiscal standpoint, your rents, your property taxes all go up and down based on the exemption of all those buildings that are on campuses that produce things like what, Lyrica. Is Northwestern known for producing Lyrica, the drug Lyrica? So you know, these profit generating tax exempt buildings that sit in the middle of your city dictate the economy and the livelihood of your city in profound and direct ways. On top of that, these universities are the biggest employers, the biggest policers, the biggest healthcare providers in your town. So you have direct relationships and responsibility to have oversight on this entity. If this was a private factory in your town, you would want to know what kind of emissions was coming out, what kind of waste, what kind of labor conditions were affecting the people that were working in that entity. The university is no different. They hide behind the specter of being a public good, right? But these are for-profit, even public entities are for-profit, profit-generating entities that have a direct relationship to the cities in which they sit. We need to be clear about that. I just want to put that out there first.
Yeah, I don't think I would add much. I would just kind of say, I think related to, I mean, I feel like this is like organizing in general, right? Like I think it's important. I think something that we talk about is like figuring out your stake in the kind of issue, and like, you know, figuring out like how you are related, how you are entangled within the system, and that's work that you can do, you know, with people who are in that similar position, right? And I feel like what organizing, I feel like at least one part of organizing, what it's really trying to do is like build up those relationships, like, you know, build more community with one another, so you can realize the things that you're feeling as an individual isn't just, you know, it's not just like oh, this is just something about me kind of thing, or like this is just like a unique situation. Like, we are under, you know, these like larger systems that like we're kind of like living through very similar conditions, so obviously, right, like we're gonna have kind of like similar reactions to them, or like you know, like that kind of thing. So I feel like when like my response to that question would just be like encouraging this person to, you know, like talk to other people, talk to their neighbors, talk to you know, maybe the students, just talk to people involved and like figure out, you know, what is the best way to plug in, because there is a space for everybody in the movement, and also like maybe the best place for you is not in the student campaign, you know, like, or not in like maybe someone in Hyde Park, like maybe the best place for them isn't Karen Cops, you know, maybe they would find more fulfillment or like more community in like a community group or something. But you know, like there are a ton of groups around, and if you don't have a group, you can like create your own and just like make sure that you are like, you know, listening to the groups that have been leading this work, you know, Black-led, abolitionists, feminists, like, you know, these kinds of groups. Like I feel like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'm gonna have.
Just real quickly, I was going to say that there are precedents for communities making demands on the part of universities. They don't get a lot of public attention. So there's a thing called a pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. Certain cities and community groups have encouraged or have demanded and received payments because, you know, the argument by universities is that we're providing a public good, providing education, but they are not paying into what they use, snow removal, electricity, the electrical grid, trash removal, police, fire. They use all these things, but don't pay into these things. And so also they're supposed to be paying into the public school system. They don't pay in. So some cities have demanded and received payments in lieu of taxes from universities because of their absence of payment. There's also things called community benefits agreements. And sometimes these CBAs include everything from job training to affordable housing land trust, to community land trust, to the creation of police oversight boards that are community-based. These things are all within the realm of possibility. And people need to know about these things. These are community-driven. So the argument here is to what mechanisms can we use to shift the levers of power away from the administration building back to the community in which these entities sit. And so these are not just about grabbing resources, it's about shifting leverage and power and authority from the ivory tower back into the communities. So I'll say that.
Yeah, thank you, Davarian. I think the next question was directed towards you and kind of picks up on that. And it's concerned with how one could negotiate the tension between expanding university spaces while ensuring that these are not infringing on the livability of the surrounding area. So this person is specifically asking about University of Chicago on the South Side and the effect on the lives of Black communities that are there and are right around the campus.
So right now, there's a major important CBA campaign on the South Side with Woodlawn. We probably all know this because of the Obama Library. And we're witnessing, as soon as the Obama Library was announced, real estate prices skyrocketed in the Woodlawn area. It became, like in 2017, the second hottest real estate neighborhood. If you know anything about Woodlawn, that's very shocking. It became, for people that are now considering moving there, not for people that live there. But the hottest neighborhood for real estate speculation. And we're seeing retail, commercial development in that area, boutique hotels, and people are afraid, and legitimately so, of profound levels of displacement. We're also finding that the UChicago South Campus that goes beyond 61st Street is exploding. And so these are the realities that we're facing. That's happening at UChicago. It's happening around St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis, and it's happening at Columbia in Manhattanville. It's happening in New Haven. It's happening in Baltimore. It's happening in South Central. I mean, let's go. It's happening in Miami. This expansion, retrenchment for dynamic is happening all over the country. And what we've seen in certain cases, for example, Columbia, they were able to win a community benefits agreement. But what we're finding is that the community benefits agreement would go to one entity that was already aligned with the university. And so therefore its impact was limited. So there must be some profound public oversight over the distribution of, so community benefits agreements are not, they're not answers unto themselves. They have to be governed. They have to be adjudicated and supervised by community stakeholders. And so this is something that needs to happen. But other people are saying that CBAs are not enough. You also have to have, for example, a planning board within the city that specifically focuses on university-based expansion, that has community members that sits on these boards, that therefore then any community-based expansion that is going forward must come before this review board and take community needs into account before it can go forward. That's one thing people have argued for. There also has been calls, and I saw this in Buffalo, that as the medical campus spread into the Fruit Belt neighborhood, you had activists creating a community land trust where the city transferred vacant lots to the community land trust that then were dictated and controlled by that trust, so that speculators couldn't follow behind university expansion and ratchet up land values. So they were able to stabilize and regulate land values in the properties controlled by the land trust, so developers couldn't follow behind universities and do what they normally do. So these are a couple of solutions, approaches, strategies that people have engaged with, but it really boils down to community oversight, community oversight, community oversight, and the ability or the capacity of political entities to be utilized and shaped in a way that serves community needs when it comes to university-based expansion in these urban campus neighborhoods.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Davarian. I think I'll maybe pose one last question for both panelists, and then we can leave some time just for breakout rooms and more informal discussion. So this question reads, what approach can we take to speak to people who are skeptical about removing police presence from educational spaces? Responses are usually dismissive, as Michelle mentioned. This person writes, I'm thinking about my experience growing up in public schools in Chicago, where gang activity functioned as a justification for CPD presence. Many people are skeptical because of the experience they've lived in those spaces. How can we get people to think beyond those previous experiences?
I just want to jump on the last question to share some thoughts. I feel like I kind of want to push back on the community oversight part of it. I feel like I feel like you know, things like CBA, land trusts, like that's one tactic at staving off gentrification, and like, you know, having kind of like institutionalized community leverage. But I feel like the answer to like university expansion is to just, you know, stop. And because, right, like I feel like if you look at universities, right, a lot of what they do is like hoard the wealth, you know, like they hoard things, they make it so that they're the only like even in terms of authority, right, like we can think about the way universities like have almost like a monopoly over especially like academic authority, you know, whatever like the knowledge they put out, right, like it is somehow like taken with more authority than like a community member who has like lived through these systems. So like how can we not just you know, build up like I agree, like I think there is real value in like CBA and all these things, but also like how can we like not see that as the end goal, but instead like one tactic of harm reduction, but like in the line of like the ultimate goal of like dissolving the university as it is today, right, as something that like hoards knowledge, hoards wealth, like acts as foundations also, right, like the way the endowments work, and like the only like a certain percentage of it is used, right, like that, these are all ways of hoarding wealth. So like how can we, like if we want to make like a university, you know, of the commons, of the people, like there are a lot of like fundamental things that also have to be dissolved.
Well, I just want to respond to that as well. Yeah, I totally agree that what I'm talking about is not the end all to be all. And I don't think I was suggesting that it was the end all to be all. But at the same time, in the same way that if we were workers in a factory and we were advocating for better relationships with our industry, we would try to do that. We would want better wages. We want better work conditions. And the reality is that in our cities today, universities are the biggest employers for low-wage labor. So if I'm working as a data entry employee at a university, yes, it would be what the ultimate goal would be to transform those relationships. But until then, I want healthcare. Until then, I want better wages. I think those are things worth fighting for. I want a different approach to the police. If the police are going to be here, until we can get them out of here, I definitely want public oversight. So I just want to say that as well.
Great. Does either of you want to share some thoughts on how to talk to people who are skeptical of these efforts, some brief best practices that come to mind?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I feel like this just comes down to, right, how like how you're having these conversations, right? Like I don't know whether I would have well, I'm sure like this person who's asking the questions, right? Like you have a lot of like personal, like you like when you have relationships with people, you know what kind of like arguments work with them, you know, like what kind of like things to say that like kind of makes sense. I feel like, right, yeah, like there will always, right, part of organizing is like meeting people where they're at, and like being in companionship with them and being in relationship with them, as they do this like transformation work and learning work, right? So I feel like, but like kind of like if I was like happen to be canvassing this person, and they responded with like, you know, how are we going to deal with like gang activity and stuff like that, I would probably say something like if you look at, like I think this work is already happening, right? Like I think Circles and Ciphers is one group, like a lot of like transformative justice kind of work happening just in Chicago, where, you know, they're trying to use what do you call it, like healing circles, peace circles, to like talk through these things and like have other ways of like dealing with violence, or dealing with harm without police, right? Because police exacerbate this. Like police also function like, you know, unchecked power, you know, also like, you know, doing just like brutalizing students, you know, in schools and stuff, right? So like police won't help. Like there are other ways, and there are other things like currently happening. There could be more things happening. Like we need to be like creating space, investing resources, and like creating these alternatives.
Yeah, I would say that at the same time, I think some of the comparison between, say, gang activity in a public school and a campus environment, we need to be careful with those comparisons, because the biggest threat on a university campus is not gang activity. It's probably going to be young men at a party or in your friendship groups, in terms of sexual violence. And we know right now, as Michelle and I both laid out pretty clearly, policing is present on these campuses, and it's an utter failure when it comes to addressing the biggest threats on these campuses. And so I would ask, and not in a snipey kind of way, but like, show me how policing has worked. And that's a real question, because if you can show me, I'm willing to have that conversation with you. But based on my estimation in the current moment, policing is not working. And so therefore, we have to think of other ways to engage harm reduction. If that's the real goal, if the real goal is harm reduction, and there's real harm and threats to people's lives on these campuses, and there is, what are we doing? What is its impact? And then we can move from there. And my estimation is that, yes, there are harms, especially to women, and particularly to women of color on campuses. Policing is the primary focus, the primary mode of harm reduction. It's not working. So let's think about other approaches. That's where I would be with it.
Great. Thank you, Davarian. I think those are wonderful words to end the general Q&A on. I want to thank both you, Davarian, and you, Michelle, for joining us today, for so many insightful questions and answers. And I invite all of you to join us for the next event that NPEP will be hosting in 2 weeks on August 11th on immigration and policing. Now I think we have some 15 minutes left, so I'll give everyone maybe 60 seconds to log off if you need or would like to leave, and then we can have a bit more of an informal discussion in breakout rooms, or depending on how many people are still there, we'll play it by ear. But thank you so much, Davarian and Michelle.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Great. Should we just keep it in this format, or I think 15 is a good group number.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
That makes sense, right? Great. So this can just be a space for other people to voice questions that haven't come up, ask questions that are on your mind after this Q&A and the panel discussion.
Do any of our GSAC members want to get things started? question.
Well, something that was really interesting for me that I had not really, I hadn't considered is how the rise in campus shootings affected the kind of like the creation of an industrial complex of like reinforcing the presence of police in educational spaces. And I think like I grew up in Chicago, and police were always a part of all of my schools had police, basically, right? But this was not necessarily related to campus shootings at the time. So I thought that was a really helpful thing to bring up and to address by Michelle and Davarian.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also, at least in my experience, kind of the biggest obstacle immediately, at least from faculty and administrators who feel like they need campus police in its current form, partly to say, to kind of your point, Davarian, that you need to be able to assure the customer, the parents of the students who are coming, that this is a safe space where these armed forces are available in case something goes sideways, without there being all that much consideration, at least from what I've seen, whether campus police actually does reduce these shootings. And you spoke a little bit about that. So it's really more, it seems to be operating much more in the symbolic space with respect to those questions than the actual empirical efficacy.
It's symbolic on campus, but it's quite terroristic off campus in terms of securing blocks to expand the university brand again for for-profit entities through commerce research, for-profit management. You know, that it has that dual effect that I think people need to be, you know, profoundly aware of. That it does do real work,
right.
You know, as well as the symbolic work.
Yeah, for sure. Alicia, did you want to hop in?
I was just going to mention that it's kind of crazy to me that you'll see so many headlines about the shootings, but you won't hear anything about how the shootings actually happened because of university police. I think that's such an important rhetoric, or lack of rhetoric used in public. Yeah.
In terms of like when a university police officer is involved and like that
Right.
this is emanating from university, oh, for sure. Yeah. No question about that.
One thing I was wondering about, Davarian, do you have any, as a faculty member, do you have any experience or thoughts on how one can mobilize? I'm transitioning into being a postdoc from being a grad student, so that's on my mind. So how can one get faculty on board to think about these questions? Because at least at Northwestern, a lot of it seems to be between students and administrators, and faculty kind of stand on the sidelines. There are certain people, you know, running prison education programs, so they're very much involved, but most of the faculty do seem to just step back and don't want to take a stake in these questions.
No, it's a shame. It's really a shame. And Michelle might be able to speak to this, but in our last conversation we had with people on a different webinar conversation, students took faculty to task for their lack of follow through. And it seems that you would think that those who are tenured, those who have job security would be more involved, but it's actually it's an inverse grid whereby those who are the most precarious are the most involved. And it's a shame of that. I mean, maybe because it's a sense of security, the sense of I see no reason to get involved, but and then the faculty that are involved in prison education programs, that are involved in social justice activities, are the more precarious faculty, and not always, but in a lot of cases that's that's the situation.
I just want to thank you. I think it was an incredible panel. I mean, like, I learned a ton, and I'm really grateful to you for joining us. So thank you so much. It's such an important, timely topic for those of us in universities, I think, to reckon with. So I'm really grateful you guys could join us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. And yeah, all right.
Okay.